The former editor of Stan News, Chong Poi-Koon, and the former acting editor-in-chief, Patrick Lamb, as well as the outlet's parent company, Best Pencil, have been found guilty of conspiracy to publish seditious materials. Now, this is a significant case that's been closely followed. They pleaded not guilty all the way back in October 2022, so this has been going on for some time. The verdict was delayed a number of times, and they face up to 2 years in jail under this sedition law, which is actually a colonial era law that was revived in the wake of those enormous protests in Hong Kong in 2019. Now, this is actually the first verdict involving a media outlet under this sedition law since the UK handed Hong Kong back to China in 1997, and the prosecution referenced 17 articles that range from commentary pieces through to features and interviews with pro-democracy former lawmakers, including Ted Hui, who's now based in Australia.
So is there anyone arguing now that there is anything close to press freedom in Hong Kong?
Well, look, the thing is, if you compare Hong Kong to China, there's certainly still a more vibrant press scene than the mainland. However, compared to what people might have been familiar with, you know, as recently as 5 years ago, Hong Kong's press scene really has been closed in on. Stan News itself closed down in 2021 after the office was raided, by the National Security Police, and these people were charged. We also saw Apple Daily close down, and other pro-democracy, openly critical news outlets like those really aren't prominent anymore or don't exist in the way that they used to. There is one other very significant trial, the most significant other trial that's going on at the moment is that of Jimmy Lai. He is the founder of Apple Daily. Now, he's been charged under the national security law, and his trial's been going on since late last year. He's in his 70s, and he's facing a life sentence if he's found guilty of those national security offences. And certainly in terms of freedoms in Hong Kong more broadly, civil society groups no longer exist there. It is not the place that it used to be, but authorities in Hong Kong do argue that these laws were necessary to crack down on the protests that were seen in 2019 and did in some cases erupt in violence and clashes between police and a small number of protesters. But now in Hong Kong to this day you really don't see any form of protest like that anymore, and certainly the press is nowhere near as vibrant as it once was.
And Kathleen, since you've taken up that position there in Taiwan, I know you were able to get over to China for the People's Congress. Have you planned to visit Hong Kong or got into Hong Kong yourself since you've been there?
Yes, I have spent a little bit of time in Hong Kong. We did recently go there for a foreign correspondent episode, which people can watch on iView and on YouTube, which really does look at what the place is like now. There are people who are still trying to do journalism and preserve the democratic values that were very unique about Hong Kong in the Chinese context. But of course, there are journalists who once worked for places like Stan News, Apple Daily, who are now in exile in places like Taiwan, like Australia as well. And there are, of course, these former lawmakers and activists who have self-exiled in some cases, who are living in places like Australia, the US, the UK. And Ted Hui, that we mentioned before, he's one of a group of people who actually have bounties on their head at the moment of the equivalent of nearly 200,000 Australian dollars. So it's an interesting spending time in Hong Kong, because certainly as a tourist it does feel quite vibrant, quite free. Certainly it feels freer than parts of the mainland, but you know, you talk to the long-term Hong Kongers, people who've left, and they really don't feel that it's the same city that they grew up in and loved.
And when you were there as a journalist, are you able to compare it to what it was like on mainland China when you were there, or you were there for the People's Congress, so it was such a big event that it was hard to compare?
Yeah, you can compare them. It certainly feels a lot less heavy in Hong Kong. Right. I think when you're on the mainland, particularly around Beijing, you do feel that people don't want to come, you know, don't want anything to do with foreign journalists. It's hard to get people to talk to you. Whereas in Hong Kong, people are still willing to talk to you about some things. They don't want to talk to you necessarily about the national security law, about Article 23, which is another domestic security law that's been brought in this year. So people steer clear of the controversial stuff, but you know, it still feels. I felt safer there. You don't feel like you have to be quite so strict about your communications, that kind of thing. In saying all that, we are increasingly being advised that we have to treat Hong Kong just like the rest of the mainland, that we should take the same precautions that we do on the mainland. But the comparison, to me at least, is still quite a contrast, although you do, you know, in Hong Kong you don't necessarily feel as kind of fancy free or as you might do here in Taiwan or even back home in Australia.